you give TPA really quickly, every 15 minutes in terms of acceleration of being able to give that patient TPA in terms of symptom onset, you get an improvement in those patients. And it's the same within the vascular therapy. Even though we use imaging as a biomarker to screen for those patients, once we know that there's a positive large vessel occlusion, we have a patient that we can treat, then we need to move quickly to be able to treat that patient. Okay? And that's it. And then I'm going to open it up to the next speaker.
I'd like to introduce our next speaker as Dr. Jeff Klingman, who's the Chief of Neurology at Kaiser Permanente in Walnut Creek. In addition to being a clinical leader in California with the California Medical Association and the Alameda and Contra Costa Medical County Associations, he's also been an author on numerous stroke treatment articles as well as guidelines. And so we're all very privileged today to hear his perspective on this topic of the advances and the updates to our new stroke guidelines.
Thanks. So, as mentioned, we have I'm working with Kaiser Permanente, but actually one of my jobs is chair of the chief, so kind of over neurology. And so we kind of look at the entire spectrum. So we've got 21 hospitals we're dealing with, 4 million people, actually 4.3 million. So we got to kind of look at that entire thing. So I'm going to kind of give you a systems-based approach. Not so much, it gets down to the individual, but also kind of how do you put the system together. Given that I'm an old guy, I get to talk about history. When I was in medical school, AIDS had not been invented yet. It was invented while I was in medical school, and then it became a chronic illness. When I was in medical school, stroke treatment was you push the patient to the back of the emergency room because we didn't have a whole lot to offer. So I'm hoping that we get with stroke, and we're getting there the same way we did with AIDS, which is suddenly it became a more chronic disease that's very treatable, and stroke is in a similar vein, because this is, you know, this was 1996. So 96, IV alteplase came out, and originally within 3 hours. And some of this will be a little redundant, but I'll go through it quickly. And so we had something to give in the first 3 hours. That's pretty exciting. And it didn't take a lot. So number needed to treat to prevent a major disability is only 4 cases. That's remarkable, because these are people that are in the middle of having a stroke that already have a deficit. And it only takes you 4 treatment to have a substantial improvement. That's really impressive. Most other things are for prevention, but this is after the thing has already happened. And again, as mentioned, very time sensitive. And we keep coming back to that, and we will keep coming back to that. One way to look at it, this kind of got mentioned, but if you look at another way to look at it is that number needed to treat versus number needed to harm. And you can see in the very early times, as was pointed out, you don't need to treat that many people to see the benefit. But by the time you get up to 4.5 hours, you're still okay. But over that time, it takes your number needed to harm actually is less than the number needed to treat. So you're just done in terms of taking all comers with time. We will get to the fact that the next phase of this is going to get into imaging, where we may be able to expand that. And then, as was mentioned, you can't treat everybody with stent retriever. In 2013, at the International Stroke Conference in Hawaii, there were very, very disappointed clot retriever manufacturers. They were very sad. There were a lot of long faces around. And it's because several studies, one after the other, came out and said, well, clot retrieval just doesn't work. And the reason it didn't work wasn't that the system didn't work. It was that the technology wasn't quite there, but more importantly, it came down to patient selection. So 2015, as you heard, was a publication presented in 2016. There were 4 studies showing benefit. So all of a sudden, wait, happy days are here again. Instead of the sadness, now we've got happiness. And there's a difference. You saw the number needed to treat. The reason for the differences is largely patient selection. The more restrictive your selection, the fewer people you need to treat, but the flip side is what? Fewer people potentially benefit. So kind of the Mr. Clean study was the least restrictive and still showed benefit. Number needed to treat at about 7, not as good as a more restrictive, but it doesn't offer up the treatment to more patients. Okay, so it's still time sensitive. You can see that we've now stretched out the time, but it's still a time sensitive treatment that your benefit drops over time. So time, again, super important for all of these, for both endovascular treatment as well as for IV alteplase. Now here's something that you won't hear from anyone else, because no one else really has this population-based look, but we do. The way we do it is every stroke patient presenting to a Kaiser facility in Northern California is seen at the door by a neurologist. Now how the heck do we do that? Well, it's all done by video, so in fact I'm not a real neurologist, but I play one on television. And what happens is we then keep track of everybody. And I think this is fascinating because when you're thinking about how to design a system, looking at these numbers is super important. You're not going to find this because most studies won't tell you who wasn't in the study. Why not? Because you have to get their consent to report it. So in this year, this was a 16 or 17 to 18, I think. I don't remember the year that we did this, but this is kind of getting submitted. So we saw 10,681 patients that the paramedics brought to us and said, we think these patients are having strokes. And they were right about 42% of the time. Now, why was it not more? Well, I don't want my paramedics to have a high index, or to have a low index of suspicion. If somebody's a little dizzy, I want them to bring them in. If somebody's got Bell's palsy, I want them to bring them in. Because I'd rather have that team take a look at it to identify. We get septic patients. There was a patient collapsed in the corner of Watt and Howe, actually, in Sacramento, I remember one day. And as he's brought in, they're saying, there's something wrong with this guy. He was wildly intoxicated. And that happens a lot, too. So it was only 42%, and that's still a lot. That's 4,500 strokes. That's a lot of strokes. Now, of these, we treat a very high rate. 42% got treated with IV alteplase. Now, why didn't all of them? Different reasons. Some of them are outside of the IV alteplase window. Some of them are comfort care. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. But that's a pretty high treatment rate of 42%. Most of the other rates you'll see are in the 25% range. And then we end up on every single patient, basically, there's a few exceptions, but basically everybody gets a CT angiogram in our system, and then we send anybody who's eligible for clot retrieval. And so we ended up treating 4% of the total patients brought to us, or about 10% of the actual acute strokes. So you have to look at that number, that while in fact these patients with large vessel occlusion are the sickest of the sick, it's relatively rare. So you're going to do a lot of evaluation to find those patients. You can't just say a stroke patient needs to go for endovascular. You got to do some testing involved. And it's super important when designing a system to recognize that 4 times more people benefit from IV alteplase than do from clot retrieval. Because one of my concerns is everybody's trying to find that one patient that has the large vessel occlusion and drive them to the hospital that can treat them. Well, 4 people need to be treated more quickly. So if that delay is substantial, you're going to harm more people than you can help. Now that one guy with the clot may do better, but what about the others? What about the other 4? That's the important thing to keep in mind as a system. And most of the studies that look at this only look at it from the standpoint of the patient that had the large vessel occlusion, not the ones that didn't and still needed treatment. So that's really important to keep in mind. And then, as I said, we got now the windows expanded. So we're out to 6 to 24 hours. This is fantastic. More people are able to be treated. One thing to point out on this is a really selective group. You thought the group looking for endovascular was selective. This is a super selective group. what you need is you need to be pretty independent baseline. So you can't come from a skilled nursing facility and still benefit. Why did they exclude those people? Because they were trying to get the best possible outcome. You need to have a pretty big stroke. You'll see that Diffuse 3 had an NIHSS score of 6 or more, which is a pretty big stroke. And the occlusions are in the larger vessels. They didn't go out chasing M2 or M3 strokes. And then you have to have the perfusion things. So in our group, I just recently pulled March 2018 to March 2019, and we looked at 1,220 patients in the late window. We might be a little off on the time. This is the numbers. This is whether the neurologist reported it or not. And we treated 63 patients with endovascular therapy in these late windows. So that's about 6% of all the patients brought to us for late window. So we're looking at every single one of them, but again, it's not particularly common. A lot of them get ruled out just because not sure on the time window, or the Rankin isn't there, or a large number of them aren't severe enough. There's just a lot of different reasons, but with the neurologist seeing them and all those complexities, that's how we do the evaluation. It is way less common than early window, thank goodness, because we want people to be brought to us soon. We treated about 200 or so endovascular cases in the early window. So just to recognize, it's super important, but it's also not as common. And again, that's something that you don't know about because the publications don't list that. So what about the coming attractions? Because this has changed, right? 96, no treatment. Then we got IV alteplase to 3.5, then we have it to 4.5, then we have endovascular. What's coming next? I hope what's coming next is imaging-guided treatment beyond 4.5 hours. So there have been some suggestions. This study was the wake-up study that was published last year, and what they did is they looked for MRI guidance. So they bring the patient in and get an MRI, and if it's positive on DWI but not yet positive on flare, so basically very early stroke, they would then treat. And you know, it looked like maybe they were onto something, and unfortunately they ran out of money and stopped the trial early. So we don't really know, but it's suggestive of that time window, maybe something helpful. So we're kind of hopeful. There was just another study published which was guided by perfusion imaging, again looking at non-diffuse 3, up to 9 hours. And they did seem like they showed maybe a benefit, so you didn't see a lot of zeros, but you saw a few more if you look in the alteplase group in the lower numbers. But there were, so about 7 more people benefited for about 3 that died. It's a little bit dicey to say, is this really ready for prime time yet? But you can see the direction. So we may end up with imaging guided. This one was stopped early. They said loss of equipoise. I'm not exactly sure I agree with them, but nevertheless, that was the decision. So we didn't get to the kind of numbers they wanted to see. So this is kind of, I think, the next big frontier, potentially. So that leads to the question, how do you help the most patients the most? We know faster is better. That's, without any doubt, faster is better for all types of stroke treatment. And I would point out that you need technology. Technology is required to select these people. You need that. We are stroke neurologists. It's what we do for a living. We see people. We do the full NIHSS. We've got the history. We're there with an ER doc and a team. We're right 50% of the time. That's as good as you can get. Paramedics aren't going to do any better. No studies ever showed better benefit than that. So you're still wrong 50% of the time. That's as good as it gets without technology. I can see a patient and be absolutely convinced this person has a large vessel occlusion. They're aphasic, they're hemiparetic, they got a gaze preference, and we get the CT angiogram and there's no large vessel occlusion. It's kind of striking. There are predictions. NIHSS at 8 or greater tends to be predictive with about a 50% accuracy. So it's important to recognize you'll never get 100%, and so everybody's working on the ideal scale. I don't think that's the right question. The right question is there an alternative technology? You need a CTA. You got to have that because you got to know what the vascular anatomy is. This is something that can be retrieved. Now, CTAs can be done pretty quickly, but you also need somebody to read the CT angiogram. So fortunately for us, we've got neuroradiologists sitting there reading them, which is kind of a cornucopia of riches for us, that we have that actual, we read them too, but it's lovely we've got the subspecialists sitting there as well. You also need further imaging for late windows. So you've got to have a CT perfusion study or an MR study. So technology is important and is one of the things. And just a reminder, and I'll say it again because I don't want people to lose track, alteplase is super still important, and 4 times more people benefit from alteplase. If you're at the end and you're doing the clot retrieval, you kind of tend to forget that. But if you look at the most, helping the most people, alteplase is still really a much bigger deal. So that leads to people saying, and I hear this all the time, well, how come every hospital doesn't offer this? I mean, why shouldn't you just have this available in every hospital? And the answer is pretty technical stuff. Do you want everybody treating endovascular treatment? I think not. I think that you need experts. You got to have an expert doing it. We really want somebody that's up there all the time doing it. It's difficult to get the catheter up. These are often elderly people. And so, you know, really not all centers should be doing this. There's a certain volume. In fact, for certification, Joint Commission says you have to do 30 treatments per center per year and 12 per doc per site, not just 12 per doc. So if I have a doc that's driving from one site to the other for certification, they have to do 12 at that facility. That may change. I don't know if you saw, but apparently in New York, they got a whole team that goes to the hospital. So they, rather than, it's harder to bring the patient through the city streets to the hospital, so they climb on the subway with their little stuff and go to the hospital potentially to treat it. They actually reported that because you can't get around town, apparently. Fortunately, it's not that bad here yet. Really the thing is you got to be able to transfer these people quickly, because super important, if you're going to see them in an outside hospital, you got to get them to that center. And the question is, do you get them there directly or what? And I'll talk about that a little bit. So we sort of looked at this as the studies first came out and said, we need to buy some time. We got to get these people treated fast enough that we can get that time bought. We can't possibly have them all go into the right place because of the realities of the 50% and the fact that you need technology. We need to get them transferred. And the other thing is, you know what? If it takes an hour to treat them and then you have to transfer them, you're kind of lost the game. And so we said, you know, what can we do to get the treatment times as fast as possible? And we looked at what was being done around the world. Helsinki had kind of pioneered super fast treatment. They'd gone through and said, how fast can we go? And they were routinely treating people in the 20-minute range. Now, part of the idea in Helsinki is people have 20 minutes of transfer time from the distant part, so they've got some time to get prepped. But that was the reality. Unfortunately, I did not get a trip to Helsinki. So we said, okay, how do we do to get 15 to 20-minute door to needle? We want at least half people treated in less than a half an hour, which is sort of unprecedented at the time, because the standard across the country is people struggle to hit an hour. And how do we get super fast CT angiogram and get it read and get them transferred quickly? So we basically blew the whole system up, and this is what we designed. My first problem was I didn't have neurologists at every facility. There's 21 hospitals, and they all have neurologists, but they don't have stroke neurologists standing at the door. And they can't for 24/7, right? I mean, they could, but I haven't got that much budget. So what we said is, how do we do this? That's where the video comes in. So when you are on a stroke shift, you are covering all hospitals in Northern California by video, and you meet people at the door. So that allows that early assessment. And the other thing that's really cool is you do with the ER docs, there's actually 2 docs looking at the patient simultaneously. We order the alteplase. The ER docs love that. We're actually the ones doing the order because that takes it off of them. And we really just redesigned the whole process for maximal efficiency. Before we redesigned, we used to wait for labs. Before we redesigned, they got roomed in a room, then they went down, then they came back. And we blew all that up and said, you know what, we don't room them, we see them in the alcove on the way in, we don't wait for labs if we don't need them, we treat them in the CT scanner, we order the alteplase actually before the CT scan because it takes 8 minutes to mix, so it's ready when they're ready to go. Basically, we then just go straight to CT angiogram. If we don't have the alteplase in hand, we'll go to CT angiogram, it only takes 5 minutes. If we have it, we'll treat them first. And the other thing we do to try and get that transfer as quickly as possible is as soon as we see the patient, we say, you know what, NIHSS is 11, I think this patient has a large vessel occlusion. I say, order the CCT rig, order the critical care transport now. They say, well, you don't even have the CAT scan. I don't care. You don't have a CT angiogram. I don't care. You haven't even treated them with alteplase. I don't care. Order the CT rig now, the CCT rig now, because it takes them 30 minutes to get there. So by the time you're done, they're showing up. And they, you know, like just apologize if they made the trip for nothing. And because, you know, there's a limited number of centers. Whereas Sacramento's in pretty good shape. Accordingly, you're actually in some ways better off for endovascular treatment here than you are in some other areas. The Core Bay area, for example, is not quite as, because it's got this big body of water in the middle, kind of gets in the way. So actually, it's super important to do that. The other thing I mentioned is we see every patient, and we put in, as we did this, we put standardized searchable notes. So it's in the electronic record, but we can actually go back and extract data, which is pretty cool, because if I have to go back and pull charts, the heck with it. So we standardize. It's got a little hidden thing, and one of my neurologists figured out how to do this, so we can pull all this data in pretty quickly. And so we get an NIHSS, we get what got transferred and so on, who got canceled, so that's how we know this. So this is the results. Before we put it in, our mean door to needle was pretty good. You know, it's enough to get awards from the Heart Association. We were at about, 50 minutes, kind of just below, because what was the target? Target was 60 minutes, so dang it, we're going to get 60 minutes. About 60% of the time. Hit the target. Afterwards, we said, we think the new target should be 30 minutes, and that's exactly where we got to. So you can see that dramatic change as soon as we put the new process into place. Now, the other thing that was super interesting is a stroke neurologist evaluating the patient doubles your rate of treatment. A lot of reluctance in the ER because they're kind of hanging out there by themselves, and so we doubled the number of treatments as well, which is pretty interesting. We changed the target to 30 minutes, and you can see that we have continued to increase, so more than half the time we're treating within a half an hour. Across the board at every single facility. So that even includes a little Manteca and far distant Fresno. Now that super interesting thing is we presented this last year at the International Stroke Conference, actually this year at the International Stroke Conference, again back in Hawaii, interestingly. And what we found was that not only does the numbers look better, which is one of the things, but in a real world population, patients do better if you treat faster, which you could presume, but out of a clinical trial, is it really true? And so what we said is, look, after we put it in place, we had a lower in-hospital mortality. That's pretty impressive. Actually, fewer people died in the hospital. The length of stay dropped by a day. Any hospital administrators out there? Does that make you happy? Length of stay dropped by a day from 3 days to 2 days on average. And so I use that every time somebody says, well, you're spending a lot of money. I say, and then more patients go home, which is super important. Now, I don't have the 30 to the 90-day rank-ins yet, because we just don't collect them yet. We will be, because I've got promises from all my stroke coordinators that are going to do this. But right now, the the thing is that if you go home, that's a proxy, right? So proxy, instead of going to a skilled nursing facility or rehab, who went home? That's kind of our proxy for doing better. So what's wrong with this? That sounds like a fantastic system. If we just did this everywhere, life would be great. The problem is these transfers still take too damn long. It is still painful. We order them in advance, and it just drives me nuts how long it takes. And sometimes the message is, can't come for 60 minutes or 45 minutes. It's a scarce resource. You know what else? It's the wrong resource. CCT rigs are really designed for inpatient transfers from ICU to ICU. What we're doing is we're asking them to do a job they're not designed to do, which is scoop and go. When the CCT nurse comes, and I've talked to them and I get it, the nurse is an RN, they're professionals, they're critical care RNs. This is my patient now. I need to know my patient. I need to do an evaluation. I need to examine my patient. I need to see them. I need to know their vitals. 20 minutes out the door is about as fast as I've ever seen it happen. Now, I've said to them, look, if they get worse, you're going to drive to the same place you're going. Why do you need that? But it's just a problem with the way the thing is designed. So CCT is a problem. Now, there are alternatives. Not this, Friday, I think it was. I had a stroke in Sacramento, in Roseville, actually. Stroke in Roseville, and they said, okay, I said, we're going to do the transfer. Let me know when we know when the CCT rig is coming. He says 45 minutes, and this was already a little bit late. And I said, it happened to be that the imaging was out in the parking lot in the trailer because the other one was tied up. So as we're driving, as I'm rolling down on my little cart, I'm seeing an ambulance sitting there. And I said to the RN, I said, would you go in the back? And she said, yeah. And I said, great, if I get permission from you. So I gave her permission. She jumped in the back. The ambulance that was sitting there took the patient down to Sacramento to get treated much faster than it would have been for a critical care rig. You know what the problem with that is? It's not reliable. You can't always get an RN that's willing to get in the back of the ambulance because it's somewhere that's not comfortable and familiar. The staffing in the ER, people run an ER, can you give up a nurse every time? Well, it doesn't happen that often, but let me tell you, there's times when staffing is pretty critical, so it's not a super reliable kind of thing to be able to do that. We've talked at this level about a 911 rig. We've got a stroke improvement process down in Contra Costa, now in Alameda County, to see how we can streamline this. And one of the things everybody gets excited about is we'll just pop them in the back of a 911 rig, because 911 rigs come in 8 minutes. And they don't do this whole big assessment. They don't really care. They just want to move them. So that's kind of the right tool for the job. The problem is they can't run a drip. Paramedic